Happy Earth Day. Good evening. For those joining us from places all over this earth today, good morning or good day to you. Good evening to those of us in Erie, PA, where there is still snow on the ground. I am Greg Baker, Vice President for Mission at Mercyhurst University. Thank you for attending our annual Sister Maura Smith Earth Day Lecture. We welcome all of you, Mercyhurst students, faculty, staff, and alumni. Welcome friends from the Erie community, notably members of the Benedictine Sisters and the Sisters of St. Joseph communities. Welcome friends from across our network of Sister of Mercy affiliated colleges and universities and others connected to the good work of the sisters. And we welcome many others who, like me, have grown to appreciate the balanced yet prophetic voice that Father Daniel P. Horan brings to his public and relevant theological work. Thank you to those who supported this event. Lindsay Frank and Hannah Cox, who managed many details behind the scenes. Thank you to our co-sponsors, the Evelyn Lincoln Institute for Ethics and Society, directed by Dr. Verna Ehret. This institute was made possible through a generous gift from Emily and John Costigan. Emily, a 1964 graduate of Mercyhurst College, named the institute in honor of her mother, Evelyn Jacobson Lincoln, a 1930 graduate. Thank you to our other sponsor, the Sustainability Office, managed by Colin Hurley. Lastly, thank you, Sisters of Mercy, who have with courage and integrity continued to elevate care for the earth as fundamental and non-negotiable to responsible living as a Catholic institution. This Zoom is in webinar format, so unless you are a panelist, your video and audio are automatically muted throughout. However, you can use the Q&A feature to submit a question for the end of the lecture. Please try to submit these questions within the first 30 minutes of this lecture to give us time to sort and prepare these for our speaker. We planned to host Father Dan last year to commemorate the 50th Earth Day in 2020. COVID delayed this effort, but we gather after a long year in a spirit of gratitude for Earth Day and the enduring legacy of urgent advocacy and action on behalf of more sustainable and gentle ways of living on this planet. A legendary figure among Mercyhurst University's efforts is Sister Maura Smith, this lecture's namesake. I now invite Dr. Chris Majok, Professor of History, who also assisted with planning this evening's lecture, to offer a brief tribute to this extraordinary woman.
Thank you, Greg. This evening's lecture honors the life and legacy of Sister Maura Smith. Inspired by the liberation theology movement of the 1960s, Sister Maura built her life's work around an unshakable commitment to social and environmental justice, working to establish and lead a number of organizations in the Erie community aimed at addressing systemic poverty and racism. Many of us who knew Sister Maura knew her best for her decades of environmental education and leadership up here on the Hill. After returning from the University of Florida with a PhD in biology in the late 1960s, Sister Maura established an environmental studies major at Mercyhurst College. In the spring of 1970, Sister Carolyn Herman, Mercyhurst president, asked Sister Maura to organize our campus celebration of the very first Earth Day, 51 years ago. She went on to lead the teaching of environmental sciences at Mercyhurst Prep High School, where the science classrooms now bear Sister Maura's name. Sister Maura also became the president and principal of Mercyhurst Prep, leading it through years of sustained growth. More than 20 years ago, Sister Maura helped to lead the formation of the Mercyhurst Green Team. For more than a decade, Sister Maura served as a fervent, outspoken, unwavering force in advancing environmental sustainability at Mercyhurst. From responsible landscape management to renewable energy to our West County Garden Project and many more initiatives, Sister Maura was a force of nature and for it, inspiring 2 generations of students and many of her colleagues to sustained creative work on behalf of the natural world. The Sister Maura Smith Peace Garden, located on the Mercy Walkway behind Ward Dormitory, also honors Sister Maura's extraordinary legacy. It is my honor now to introduce Colin Hurley, Executive Director of Community Engagement and Mercyhurst Sustainability Manager.
Thank you, Chris. Indeed, I have the distinct privilege of introducing our speaker for this evening. Father Daniel P. Horan is the Duns Scotus Professor of Spirituality at Catholic Theological Union in Chicago, where he teaches systematic theology and spirituality, is a columnist for the National Catholic Reporter, and the author of hundreds of articles in more than 12 books, including All God's Creatures, A Theology of Creation in 2018, and Catholicity and Emerging Personhood, a Contemporary Theological Anthropology from 2019. He has 2 new books arriving later this year, A White Catholic's Guide to Racism and Privilege, and The Way of the Franciscans, A Prayer Journey Through Lent. Father Daniel regularly lectures around the United States and abroad, serves on a number of university academic and publication editorial boards, including the St. Bonaventure University Board of Trustees, the Franciscan School of Theology Board of Regents, and the Board of Directors of the International Thomas Merton Society. He is co-host of the Francis Effect podcast. So let's give all our best virtual welcome to Father Daniel as he shares life, liberty, and the pursuit of climate justice, urgent explorations of global climate change, and the consistent ethic of life. Father Daniel.
Thank you so much, Colin, and thank you to Greg Baker, Vice President for Mission at Mercyhurst, and the entire Mercyhurst University community, all the co-sponsors, all who have made this virtual presentation and gathering possible on this Earth Day. I'm going to just go ahead here and make sure I can share my screen so folks can see that. It really is an honor and jumping ahead there, an honor and a privilege to be with the Mercyhurst community. I've had the distinct privilege of speaking on your campus several times now, and something that continues to be a cherished memory of mine is, I think twice now, I've been the celebrant and homilist at your Mass of the Holy Spirit at the opening of an academic year. Mercyhurst has a special place in my heart, so if there's one regret I have, it's kind of a bittersweet regret. The bitterness is that I can't be there in person and spend some time on your beautiful campus with the whole Mercyhurst community. The perhaps sweet lining is that because of our inability to travel and for safety reasons and all of that, my carbon footprint's a little bit lower than it would be ordinarily. So for that, perhaps I give thanks. I should also say that I'm deeply honored to be invited to offer this year's lecture in memory of Sister Mara Smith. I appreciate the wonderful tribute to her that was just shared. And I've had the opportunity to learn a little bit more about her as well. And I admire her legacy as a professor and advocate for the more than human world. And I believe that her legacy, not just at Mercyhurst University, but beyond it, is a real example for us all. So with that in mind and in her spirit, let me begin. In 1988, the Catholic Bishops' Conference of the Philippines issued a pastoral letter titled, "What is Happening to Our Beautiful Land?" 27 years before Pope Francis would promulgate his landmark encyclical letter Laudato Si on care for our common home, in which that same question would frame the opening chapter of his encyclical letter. The bishops of the Philippines were attuned to the shifting ecological context of our modern times, noting that the increasing environmental challenges and catastrophes witnessed in the Pacific and around the globe were not mere coincidences or isolated events. Near the end of their prophetic pastoral document, the bishops of the Philippines state soberly and clearly that the ecological crises before us constitute what they call, and I quote, the ultimate pro-life issue. Sadly, in the intervening 33 years, 2 tragic realities have unfolded that should give us all cause for concern. The first is that, sadly, few church leaders and ordinary Christians alike, especially in our own country, the United States, have accepted that foundational truth that was expressed by the bishops of the Philippines, namely that global climate change is indeed the ultimate pro-life issue. Instead, ecclesial infighting, culture warrior mentality, and sectarian political influences have coalesced to reduce the beautiful teaching of the church around a whole host of interrelated life issues to a restricted focus on just merely one or two. The second cause for concern is, of course, not only the persistence of ecological devastation and climate change, but its increasingly devastating effects around the globe. These we might identify as the ecological signs of our times. This is a satellite image of that horrific hurricane just a few years back in Houston. We could think about the wildfires in the United States West and Northwest, and in the western provinces of Canada. We could think about the wildfires in Australia and elsewhere around the globe. Increased hurricanes, tsunamis, other disturbances. And sadly, and increasingly more permanently, drought. Here's an image from a drought in India in spring of 2017. As Pope Francis noted early on in Laudato Si, regrettably, he says, many efforts to seek concrete solutions to the environmental crisis have proved ineffective, not only because of powerful opposition, but also because of a more general lack of interest. He continues, he says, obstructionist attitudes, even on the part of believers, can range from denial of the problem to indifference, nonchalant resignation, or blind confidence in technical solutions. We require a new and universal solidarity. All of us can cooperate as instruments of God for the care of creation, each according to his or her own culture, experience, involvements, and talents. Unfortunately, as the Holy Father notes, the blame for this continuing ecological crisis is placed as much on Christian believers and church leaders as it is on anybody else. The failure to first acknowledge and then take seriously the urgency of our environmental emergency is a grave ecological sin. This phrase, ecological sin, is something that both Pope Francis and Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew have used to describe the sinfulness, the actions and inactions on humanity's part in contributing to the crises we face. Given that today is the 51st celebration of Earth Day, I think it's fitting that we pause to reflect together on, as we in the Catholic tradition pray every week, on what we have done and what we have failed to do in response to what Brazilian theologian Leonardo Boff and Pope Francis himself have both called the interconnected cry of the earth and cry of the poor. For Christians in particular, part of this process of ongoing conversion in the life of discipleship is to regularly engage in what we call an examination of conscience, through which we call to mind our sins. We acknowledge them with contrition, and we seek reconciliation and right relationship in response. So my invitation for us today, this evening, or for our brothers and sisters on the other parts of the world this morning or tomorrow morning, for all of us here today, it's to collectively engage in an ecological examination of conscience, to attend to the ways we are being challenged by the Holy Spirit to recognize the richness and complexity of our world and the manifold ways our faith tradition ought to challenge us to recognize the unequivocal climate emergency we are facing today as the most important life issue. So my lecture is organized into three parts. First, I want to offer an overview of the Catholic concept of the consistent ethic of life, which provides a comprehensive and integrating approach to thinking about moral norms and our response to all different kinds of injustices in our world. Second, I argue that global climate change is the most important life issue today, and that it is the foundational and unifying concern that underlies all other particular life issues. Finally, I invite us to consider where we go from here by exploring the implications that recognizing and accepting the urgency of global climate change present to us in terms of prioritizing climate justice in our embrace of integral ecology and the consistent ethic of life. As theologians have noted, the late Cardinal Joseph Bernardine of Chicago was not the originator of the concept known as the consistent ethic of life. However, what is indisputable is that Bernardine's prominence as the Archbishop of Chicago and a vocal proponent of the concept as central to his episcopal pastoral and teaching ministry focused light and attention on this ancient moral tradition in the late 20th century, at a time when political and ecclesial polarization was beginning to increase, and I would argue has only subsequently increased. Theologians and historians alike point to the evening of December 6, 1983 as pivotal, This was when Bernardine gave the Gannon Lecture at Fordham University in New York on the theme, A Consistent Ethic of Life, an American Catholic Dialogue. The immediate context of his remarks were twofold. First, he was then recently named the chairman of the U.S. Bishops' Pro-Life Committee. And second, he was asked to speak on a topic related to the U.S. Bishops' pastoral letter on peace, which was published earlier the very same year. With these elements in mind, the Cardinal said, and I quote, "I believe the Catholic moral tradition has something valuable to say in the face of the multiple threats to the sacredness of life today. And I am convinced that the Church is in a position to make a significant defense of life in a comprehensive and consistent manner." Written and promulgated in the midst of the Cold War, the 1983 U.S. Bishops' Pastoral Letter on Peace focused primarily on the arms race and the question of national and international policies shaped by so-called nuclear deterrence. Bernardine noted at the time that the principal conclusion of the document is that the Church's social policy role is at least as important in defining key questions in the public debate as in deciding such questions. He added, and I quote, "The impact of the pastoral letter was due in part to its specific positions and conclusions, but it was also due to the way it brought the entire nuclear debate under scrutiny." Now, this is no small point. Bernardine was acknowledging that the conclusions or expression of universal moral norms presented from within the Catholic perspective are not the only significant aspect of Catholic ethical thinking in the public square. Even at that time in the early 1980s, there was a movement rising that sought to align religious conservatives with partisan political interests in order to leverage particular niche issues in what has become known as the culture wars. In particular, the issue of abortion dominated many conversations about Catholic morality, social policy, and public norms. In his capacity as the leading pro-life bishop, the pro-life committee chairman for all U.S. bishops, Bernardine joined theological ethicists and policy advisors in seeking to remind the Catholic hierarchy and the general faithful alike that Catholic morality is not a myopic, single-issue enterprise, but is in fact a rich, diverse, integrated, and dynamic tradition, the parts of which cannot simply be treated in isolation. Because the challenge of peace, that's the name of that U.S. bishop's pastoral letter, because it concentrates on nuclear weapons and war, which portend an indiscriminate threat to life unlike anything else known at the time, Bernardine believed that it provided a distinctive starting point for developing a consistent ethic of life. Whereas previous centuries of Christian theological reflection on the sinfulness or justifiableness of taking human life concentrated on isolated instances of war, murder, capital punishment, and the like, the question of the sacredness of life in the nuclear age changed the context for moral reasoning in new and significant ways. At the heart of the paradigmatic shift are questions related to the rapid developments in technology, those that occasion the development of atomic weaponry, as well as those emerging technologies. As we'll see shortly, this also implicates the technological conditions that have contributed to human-caused global climate change and other forms of environmental degradation. As Bernardine put it in his lecture, the essential question in the technological challenge is this: in an age when we can do almost anything, how do we decide what we ought to do? The even more demanding question is, in a time when we can do anything technologically, how do we decide morally what we never should do? In response to these questions occasioned by rapid technological development, Bernardine says, and I quote, "Asking these questions along the spectrum of life from womb to tomb creates the need for a consistent ethic of life. For the spectrum of life cuts across the issues of genetics, abortion, capital punishment, modern warfare, and the care of the terminally ill. And we can today properly add global climate change and climate justice to that same list." Whereas at that time, and especially now, there have been those who want to isolate discrete life issues to the exclusion of others, arguing for a kind of preferential treatment, or to borrow the ill-advised language of some statements of late, to identify a singular, quote, preeminent issue. Bernardine and others kept drawing the attention of their brother bishops to theologians and to the general public to the foundational principles that inform all Catholic Christian responses to life issues. Bernardine explained himself, and I quote, "We intend our opposition to abortion and our opposition to nuclear war to be seen as specific applications of this broader attitude. We have also opposed the death penalty because we do not think its use cultivates an attitude of respect for life in society. The purpose of proposing a consistent ethic of life," he goes on, "is to argue that success on any one of the issues threatening life requires a concern for the broader attitude in society about respect for human life." Cardinal Bernardine goes on to explain that the unifying foundation for all of Catholic moral theology's critiques of various threats to life stem from the unequivocal respect for life that is demanded of all people as revealed to us by the God of Jesus Christ. No one is exempt from that dignity and value, and it is no one's right to deny the dignity, value, and life of another. Bernardine illustrates this sense of the universal dignity and value of life and its interconnectedness across the human family with a reflection that begins with the issue of abortion, but listen to what he does. He says, "If one contends as we do that the right of every fetus to be born should be protected by civil law and supported by civil consensus, then our moral, political, and economic responsibilities do not stop at the moment of birth. Those who defend the right to life of the weakest among us must be equally visible in support of the quality of life of the powerless among us, the old and the young, the hungry and the homeless, the undocumented immigrant and the unemployed worker." He continues, he says, "Such a quality of life postures translates into specific political and economic positions on tax policy, employment generation, welfare policy, nutrition and feeding programs, and healthcare. Consistency means we cannot have it both ways. We cannot urge a compassionate society and vigorous public policy to protect the rights of the unborn on the one hand, and then argue that compassion and significant public programs on behalf of the needy somehow undermine the moral fiber of society or are beyond the proper scope of governmental responsibility." Bernardine's focus was on the importance of consistency and honesty in assessing how the church and its members view and understand the world around us. The key is to avoid entrapping oneself and others into silos of partisan moral myopia, as if you could justifiably pick and choose which category of life is worthy of protection or worthy of love or worthy of flourishing. But what is also striking about Bernardine's remarks about the consistent ethic of life over his many addresses is how every particular focus on human right to life issues arises from a more basic or foundational conviction about the importance of protecting life itself. As theologian Anatoly Asaneta has written, and I quote, "Individuals and groups who pursue one or several issues should do so in ways that support a systemic vision of life. The principle that Christians ought to have an understanding of the sacredness of life that transcends singular demographics and reaches across the spectrum of social locations and circumstances requires a capacious sense of God's love and call for us to love one another as God has first loved us. And this is a love that is expressed gratuitously and, importantly, without condition. Such a hermeneutic of love ought to impel us to see how interconnected the seemingly disparate foci of the pro-life movement actually are, and as we'll see shortly, this extends to and relies upon an understanding of life in the more than human world too. So allow me to talk about climate justice as the thread that holds the seamless garment together. 2 years ago, at the beginning of the annual ecumenical season of creation observance, which lasts every year from the beginning of September until the Feast of St. Francis, which is October 4th, I wrote a column in National Catholic Reporter titled, "Climate Change is the Most Important Life Issue Today." In it, I argued that in the age of rampant deterioration of what Pope Francis calls our common home, devastation that has resulted in part from human activity and our hubris, the season of creation was not only a time for us to reflect on the importance, inspiration, and beauty of the more than human world, but it was also an opportunity to focus our attention on the most fundamental issues of justice and peace, particularly as they pertain to our ethical commitment to life issues. As noted earlier, in recent decades, there has been a lot of nasty infighting among Catholics who argue about which life issue is the most important, especially in guiding one's political choices. Some groups, often the loudest and at times the most well-funded, claim that abortion is the single most important life issue. Others say euthanasia or assisted suicide is the most important. Yet, there are others, like the late Cardinal Bernardine, who, in keeping with the Church's longstanding tradition of the sanctity of all life, say that we cannot single out one such issue, but recognize as Catholics that we must maintain this consistent ethic of life I described earlier, an ethical outlook that is also sometimes referred to as the seamless garment approach. Now, while I agree with the intellectual and moral integrity of this consistent ethic of life principle that I've outlined, that because it upholds every aspect of human life and suggests and argues for that all life is inherently valuable, dignified, and must be protected, we nevertheless live in a time in which there is now a more fundamental issue that threatens all life in a manner not seen since the creation of atomic weaponry in the early 20th century, the very thing that occasioned that 1983 pastoral letter on peace from the US bishops. And what I'm referring to this evening is climate change. For this reason, it seems to me dangerously short-sighted to propose directing our attention, our argumentative energies, and our financial resources to any singular anthropocentric ethical issue, right? We can all agree that all human life is sacred. No matter how singularly compelling or emotionally attractive such an individual cause may appear, there's something far more insidious that's taking place and unfolding in our midst today. The stakes are simply too high for us now to be so limited in our ethical visions, so self-referential when the entire concept of life is at stake. Global climate change threatens every life now and poses an existential danger to the very condition of the possibility for future life on our planet. If we are called to be moral agents guided by a seamless garment approach, one that recognizes an interconnectedness of life, as I believe that we are, and I believe that Cardinal Bernardine insisted that we are, I believe that today climate justice is the thread that ties together that seamless garment, that undergirds and anchors the consistent ethic of life. The preservation of any particular human life or groups of human lives is predicated on the future of the planet and a delicate ecosystem on it, or I should say in plurality, the various ecosystems on this planet that make life in all its forms possible at all. We might ask ourselves tough questions like, what good is it to prevent abortions or save the elderly from euthanasia or ensure the elimination of capital punishment if there is no air to breathe, no water to drink, no land to farm, no plants or animals to eat, no habitats that are free from flooding or hurricanes, wildfires, tornadoes, earthquakes, or some other devastating weather phenomena? I want to be clear, lest people misunderstand where I'm coming from, that I'm not suggesting that we ignore those particular issues that threaten various forms of human life. They indeed demand our prayer. They demand our action as well. However, there is a uniquely dire valence, a characteristic that is unique to what is happening to our planet in a very limited window of time that we have to do anything to save the very possibility of life for us and for future generations at all. There are some people, I believe, who rightly understand the gravity of our circumstances that should govern our response. Pope Francis, for example, in Laudato Si, situates that teaching on creation and the human family within the broader tradition of Catholic moral teaching. And he reminds the Church and the world that despite our self-centered compartmentalization, there is only ever an integral ecology in which the fate of humanity and non-human creation are inextricably intertwined. While the human poor have been and will always be the first to suffer the consequences of climate change's effects, ultimately no one can escape the destruction of our common home. Likewise, Greta Thunberg, the 16-year-old, or maybe now 17-year-old Swedish climate activist, is another prophetic voice on this life issue today. Back in the fall of 2019, you may recall she made a sailing trip across the Atlantic Ocean to New York City for a meeting of the United Nations climate talks. Her style of travel was a mode of long-distance transportation with zero carbon emissions, which put her activism on behalf of the ecological crises we currently face really in the spotlight. Back at the age of 15, she helped launch a series of school strikes and climate demonstrations across Europe and beyond, which shows that wisdom is not reserved for the old alone, and that our younger sisters and brothers can teach and lead us. She is not much younger than many of you students currently enrolled at Mercyhurst. She has regularly made the point that no one is too small or too young to make a difference. And that same slogan became the title of a small collection of her climate speeches in a book that was published in 2019. Yet, as Thunberg has often said, it is up to adults who have power now to do something. In a 2018 speech, she accused world leaders of stealing their children's future in front of their very eyes. She sagely admonished the world, and I quote, "Until you start focusing on what needs to be done rather than on what is politically possible, there is no hope. We cannot solve a crisis without treating it as a crisis." One of the major problems we face today as a society and as a church is that too few people listen to these inspired voices, the voices of prophets in our midst like Pope Francis and Greta Thunberg. And some people, including far too many political leaders and television personalities and anonymous people on the internet, are doing the exact opposite of what is necessary by spreading conspiracy theories and sowing doubt or dismissing the seriousness of our circumstances outright. By way of example, we can think about all of the ways in which certain politicians have sought to roll back environmental policies. The previous presidential administration, by one report, rolled back 84 environmental rules and policies in just 4 years. The report, citing a New York University study, explains, all told, the Trump administration's environmental rollbacks could significantly increase greenhouse gas emissions and lead to thousands of extra deaths from poor air quality alone every year, end quote. No one who aspires to be truly pro-life, who cares about justice and peace, can support environmental policies like that, or really the lack of environmental policies. And yet thousands, if not millions, of self-identified Christians continue to embrace such anti-life positions and even dismiss or relegate concerns about climate change in order to focus on some niche life issues. As political and ecclesial polarization continues to rise, some people will inevitably claim and preach and advertise that a singular anthropocentric life issue is the only litmus test for judging a political candidate or a public policy as morally sound. Despite what some individual bishops have tweeted or stated personally, the USCCB, the US Bishops' Conference, has repeatedly in its official documents reminded us that this is a kind of illogical absolutism. And they state, as they did in their voting guide just last year, that, quote, as Catholics, we are not single issue voters. A candidate's position on a single issue is not sufficient to guarantee a voter support. And we can expand that to recognize it's not just about what we do in the ballot box with our voting. It's about how we live our lives. As Catholics, we're not single issue people. I agree with our bishops on this point. We cannot be so simplistic and reductive as to make what is meant to be well-informed and thought-out decision about our governmental representation and leadership and policy making simply a binary yes or no referendum on this or that ethical case or ideological point. We must take the whole range of issues relating to peace and justice into consideration when we cast our votes, when we make our choices, when we determine how we're going to order our communities, our lives, our families. And this is what is at the heart of a consistent ethic of life and reflects precisely what Cardinal Bernardin was saying. Nevertheless, there will be a natural inclination to order our priorities and to take stock of what is most important in the moment. The magnitude of climate change's threat to life, all life, human and non-human life alike, eclipses everything else. It's just a matter of fact. People are already dying from its consequences, and more people will follow. This is not even to mention the hundreds and thousands of species of non-human animals and creatures that have died. As the Amazon forest continues to burn at an alarming rate, as polar ice caps keep melting, as sea levels keep rising, thousands of species become endangered and then extinct, and numerous other travesties arising from this ecological crisis imperil life on this planet. We need to be serious as people of faith and acknowledge that global climate change is the most important issue today. We must act in accordance with this realization. This is where I wish to return to Pope Francis's teachings, particularly in his encyclical Laudato Si, and even more recently in his post-synodal exhortation on the Pan-Amazon region from last year. That document, Querda Amazonia, is a deeply pro-life text. Among other topics, it builds on the central theme of Pope Francis's 2015 encyclical, which is the notion of integral ecology. Pope Francis states clearly in the opening of this exhortation, he says, "I wish merely to propose a brief framework that can apply concretely to the life of the Amazon region as a synthesis of some of the larger concerns that I have expressed in earlier documents, and that can help guide us to a harmonious, creative, and fruitful reception of the entire synodal process." He explained in that text that he is addressing the present exhortation to the whole world, because what is seen in the Pan-Amazon region is illustrative for what already is or will be experienced elsewhere around the globe. Returning to Laudato Si, we see how the notion of integral ecology governs the internal logic of this magisterial teaching. While I don't have time to offer a full exploration of the concept and its implications throughout Laudato Si and elsewhere, we can summarize integral ecology, which is a bit of a mouthful, it sounds like a technical phrase, to emphasize this theme that everything is connected. That notion appears at the outset of Laudato Si and is echoed throughout and subsequently in the Pope's teaching. With this notion that everything is connected, this idea that is both scientific and at the same time faith-based, the Pope critiques the tendency that many Christians have to compartmentalize their faith and moral imaginations, arbitrarily separating themselves and their personal interests from those of the broader human and non-human communities. Just as Cardinal Bernardine critiqued single-minded bishops and politicians for disregarding our Christian call to maintain a consistent ethic of life, Pope Francis likewise expands that inclusive vision of God's reign and the moral norms that arise from it by pointing toward the need for an integral ecology. In response to such widespread tendencies to isolate particular life issues, Pope Francis makes a holistic argument about integral ecology, alluding to the Catholic truism of both and reasoning. You've probably heard this before, right? I know I'm fond of emphasizing that in the Catholic tradition, we're a community of both and, not either or. Jesus Christ is both fully divine and fully human. You and I are made of both physical matter, right? We say body and soul. And so Pope Francis uses this, and he says, since everything is closely interrelated, and today's problems call for a vision capable of taking into account every aspect of the global crisis, I suggest that we now consider some elements of an integral ecology, one which clearly respects its human and social dimensions, unquote. Now, given that Laudato Si is officially part of the Church's social teaching, its insights and lessons have bearing on how we view social order, politics, scientific inquiry, theological reflection, and moral norms. To talk about an integral ecology in this light is to reiterate the interconnectedness of all human persons to one another and our inextricable place within the singular cosmic web of creation. Pope Francis says, it cannot be emphasized enough how everything is interconnected. Time and space are not independent of one another, and not even atoms or subatomic particles can be considered in isolation. Just as the different aspects of the planet, physical, chemical, and biological, are interrelated, so too living species are part of a network which we will never fully explore and understand. A good part of our genetic code is shared by many living beings. It follows that the fragmentation of knowledge and the isolation of bits of information can actually become a form of ignorance unless they are integrated into a broader vision of reality. For people who aren't familiar with church teaching or haven't read much of Pope Francis's writings, you may be struck by how direct, how sincere, how unabashed, and how scientifically grounded his ethical and theological teaching is. A true sense of interconnectedness suggests that one cannot merely select, as I've been saying, a single ethical issue in isolation as if it were unrelated to others. For instance, the focus on abortion in isolation, since that is oftentimes identified by some in the church as a, quote, preeminent issue, this does not adequately reflect the church's teaching on an integral ecological approach. Again, the Holy Father says everything is connected. Such approaches reject the church's call for a broader vision of reality. As insidious and horrifying as some particular threats to human life are, such sins and crimes against humanity always already exist within a broader context that must also be considered. As I outlined earlier, narrowly defined defenses against this or that part of the human population are futile if there is no habitable planet. If we can't have a functioning common home on which our lives and the lives of other creatures can flourish, then what's the point? The global climate catastrophe we face today, caused and exacerbated by our human activity, is indeed the most pressing life issue because it threatens not just one vulnerable or marginalized part of humanity, but it threatens the life of all and non-human creatures. In light of the church's teaching on integral ecology and the inherent dignity and value of all life, I believe it worthwhile today for the whole church community to return to the principle of this consistent ethic of life. Just 3 months after delivering that lecture I opened with at Fordham, Cardinal Bernardin spoke at St. Louis University, and he described the seamless garment metaphor, borrowing the creative image from the Passion narrative about Jesus's cloak that was not divided and for which the guards cast lots. Like that garment, a Catholic pro-life ethic must be envisioned as a singular whole, constituted by all the particular issues that threaten life, but grounded in something more fundamental and consistent. While nuclear annihilation, which was, you will recall, Bernardin's starting point 38 years ago, sadly, it still remains a real possibility, there nevertheless exists today an even greater threat to all life, and it is the active destruction of this planet. When Cardinal Bernardin spoke in the 1980s about the seamless garment approach to Catholic moral theology, recognizing the necessity of a consistent ethic of life, that primary emphasis was on the universal value and dignity of human life. It was certainly a comprehensive approach, one that improved on a kind of a la carte style that a lot of so-called pro-lifers who pick and choose their issues of choice would embrace. However, it did not focus attention on this more fundamental life issue that we recognize today in terms of our common home. Today, with additional teaching, the teaching of Laudato Si and Quieredam Amazonia, added to the universal teaching of the church, we have an opportunity to enlarge the seamless garment, redesigning it to accommodate the full range of life issues connected to each other, as understood according to an integral ecology. Not only does pro-life mean embracing the seamless garment, but it also requires that our concern for and protection of life be shaped by this integral ecology, which recognizes indeed everything is connected and nothing is meant to be treated in isolation. I believe that the way we can better ensure that nothing is treated in isolation in this sense, but that we instead work toward embracing an integral ecology in which we recognize that everything is indeed connected, is by recognizing that climate justice is the very thread that holds the seamless garment together today. In her bold and inspiring and prophetic address at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, in January of 2019, Greta Thunberg opened with the now famous and striking lines, and I quote, "Our house is on fire. I am here to say our house is on fire. According to the IPCC, we are less than 12 years away from not being able to undo our mistakes." Later in her address, she echoes my own view that nothing else compares in scope or impact to the threat that the current climate emergency presents to humanity and non-human creation. Thunberg says, and I quote, And since the climate crisis is a crisis that never once has been treated as a crisis, people are simply not aware of the full consequences from our everyday life. No other current challenge can match the importance of establishing wide public awareness and understanding of our rapidly disappearing carbon budget that should that should become our new global currency and the very heart of our future and present economics, end quote. In addition to the human economics, that ordering of our society that comes from the Greek words oikos, meaning household, is in ecology, and nomos, meaning law or organization. That's where economy comes from, which too many people limit to the realm of finance. We are called to place the climate crisis at the very heart of our Catholic faith community and theological ethics. That's what a climate economy is all about. To this end, I want to draw from and build on the recent work of the Filipino theologian Anatoly Aseneta, who I cited earlier in my talk. And he outlines what he calls 3 aspects toward an ecologically sensitive, consistent ethic of life. First, Aseneta notes that the ruin of our common home undermines the integrity not only of non-human creation, which is God's work too and has intrinsic value, but also of human life. He adds that, and I quote, "While ecological disasters may not be as frequent and direct as abortion, euthanasia, and capital punishment, they can be in due course, not only life-threatening, but also fatal." I think this is a really important point. As Princeton professor Rob Nixon notes in his 2011 book, Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor, just because those who are in powerful social locations or positions of influence do not immediately recognize or experience the detrimental effects of the rising climate crisis does not mean that this doesn't have consequential and deleterious effect on others. His primary focus is on the human community and the environmental effects that lead to phenomena like environmental racism and the disproportionate burden that environmental degradation has on poorer communities. In this sense, Nixon, in his secular analysis, aligns well with Pope Francis's invocation of Leonardo Boff's observation about the connectedness between the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. With Catholic social teachings' unequivocal emphasis on the preferential option for the poor and marginalized, this disproportionate burden and harm placed on the lives of the poor and marginalized is further reason to recognize the primacy of climate justice. But beyond the realm of human society, we might also view non-human creation as itself part of the community of the oppressed. Pope Francis suggests as much in the opening of Laudato Si when he, invoking his own namesake, St. Francis of Assisi, describes our sister Mother Earth as one of the victims of anthropogenic, that is, human-caused climate change and ecological devastation. Pope Francis writes, "This sister, our sister Mother Earth, now cries out to us because of the harm we have inflicted on her by our irresponsible use and abuse of the goods with which God has endowed her. We have come to see ourselves as her lords and masters, entitled to plunder her at will. The violence present in our hearts wounded by sin is also reflected in the symptoms of sickness evident in the soil, in the water, in the air, and in all forms of life. This is why," Pope Francis says, "this is why the earth herself, burdened and laid waste, is among the most abandoned and maltreated of our poor. She groans in travail. We have forgotten that we ourselves are dust of the earth. Our very bodies are made up of her elements. We breathe her air, and we receive life and refreshment from her waters." The community of creation is much larger than the anthropocentric focus on our human concerns would have us believe. Our ecological sinfulness is a form of oppression, subjecting the very foundation of life itself, that harmony and balance of God's creation, which sustains us and gives us life, to risk of destruction. Therefore, to talk about being for life, being for liberty or freedom, requires that we prioritize climate justice and seek right relationship among human and non-human creation alike. Second, Aseneta notes that the gradual destruction of our common home reveals a profoundly moral dimension, particularly in terms of justice and equality. The contemporary ecological crisis is unjust chiefly because it is caused by a few, namely more affluent and developed societies, while disproportionately harming the poor and the vulnerable, who have contributed the least to climate change. In this regard, Aseneta is pointing to the importance of Bernardine's insistence on consistency. If the pro-life movement is truly concerned with the most vulnerable in our society, seeking to prioritize the care of those whose lives and quality of life are most at stake, then one cannot merely bracket climate change as some unrelated issue in isolation. The call for climate justice is directly and indirectly a call for restorative justice among the disenfranchised. Pope Francis talks a lot about ecological conversion in Laudato Si. In many ways, this is what Aseneta is suggesting with our bolder incorporation of our current climate catastrophe more overtly in the consistent ethic of life. Those who are in privileged social locations, both locally and globally, have to examine our consciences for what we have done and failed to do in cooperation with this systemic evil. Part of this includes the indifference Pope Francis so regularly decries. But part of this also includes our own self-centeredness, both as a privileged community of affluent people, and here I'm thinking especially of those in Western Europe and in North America, and as members of the broader species of Homo sapiens, the human family, which has turned everything other than ourselves, and even sometimes other members of our own human community, into objects for instrumental evaluation. That is more than indifference. That is more than a sin of omission. That is the commission of ecological sin. Finally, Aseneta links Cardinal Bernardine's skepticism about technology when he was first developing the notion of the consistent ethic of life with Pope Francis's concern around uncritical embrace of technologies that promise easy solutions without regard for human and non-human costs and the potential, yet unexamined, consequences of such technology. This principle behind the consistent ethic of life is easily recognizable in areas of warfare, like the development of atomic weapons, or in medicine with procedures for medically assisted suicide, but may not seem as immediately apparent when it comes to the environment. And yet, rising carbon emissions, deforestation, pollution, extinction, and other aspects of our climate crisis all stem from developments in technology, which are then deployed without adequate critical moral reflection. In the end, one cannot talk about Catholic moral norms or theological ethics without some recourse to global climate change and the need for ecological conversion and ultimately the pursuit of climate justice. Anything short of that comprehensive, consistent ethic of life is merely solipsistic, self-referential, short-sighted, or just simply wrong. In closing, my intention this evening has been to invite us to think more critically about the climate crisis before us, which each of us is in part responsible for creating and therefore responsible for addressing. On this Earth Day, it is especially appropriate for us to engage in an examination of conscience, to reflect on what we have done and what we have failed to do, while renewing our commitment to pursue genuine climate justice. It is not easy. I'm under no delusion that it is. And it cannot be accomplished alone. That's impossible. But with our Catholic moral tradition grounding us, all of our moral reasoning ought to be guided by a consistent ethic of life that sees the interconnectedness of all creation, human and non-human alike, leading us to see anew the world in terms of an integral ecology. While the magnitude of the challenge before us in the face of global climate change can be and certainly is daunting, I must say that I do have some hope. And I'm not just pandering here to the Mercyhurst crowd, but that hope comes in the form of the wisdom and activism that I see in the younger generations, particularly those members of Generation Z, many of whom are joining us as students at Mercyhurst tonight. So I want to amplify the wisdom of your generation. I want to give the last words of my presentation to one of your own, someone I've already cited and mentioned, but somebody who I think all of us, especially those of us committed to faith and to Catholic moral theology, and to living out our convictions ought to pay more attention to. Let us return to the conclusion of Greta Thunberg's Davos address, in which she powerfully articulates the signs of our times and challenges us to wake up to see the urgency of the crisis we face. She says, "We are now at a time in history where everyone with any insight of the climate crisis that threatens our civilization and the entire biosphere must speak out in clear language, no matter how uncomfortable and unprofitable that may be. We must change almost everything in our current societies. The bigger your carbon footprint, the bigger your moral duty. The bigger your platform, the bigger your responsibility. Adults keep saying, we owe it to the young people to give them hope. But I don't want your hope. I don't want you to be hopeful. I want you to panic. I want you to feel the fear I feel every day. And then I want you to act. I want you to act as if you would in a crisis. I want you to act as if our house is on fire, because it is." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Father Horan. I really appreciate the thoughtfulness and the language that you've used here, the way that you've drawn on documents like Laudato Si, that is such an important document. And the vocabulary is really useful here to think about these ideas. So we have a few questions from the audience, if you don't mind answering a few questions.
I'd love to, thank you.
And I can rephrase some of these if the questions don't make sense the way I'm presenting them to you. But could you talk a little bit, given everything that you're talking about here and the centrality of climate justice in light of all of the other social justice issues that we're facing as a society, some of which you've already touched on in your talk? Can you talk about what kinds of things we would need to do, how our lives might change if we were to take seriously the notion of the greater than human world into our moral communities, into a sense of obligation to those things?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. I think one of the first places to begin is to go back to something I mentioned in passing this evening, which is, thinking of Catholicism in particular as a both and tradition. And I would extend this to kind of Orthodox Christianity more broadly, that it's not an either or, but these are categorical differences. So when we're talking about, the human family and the various social injustices that the human family face, those are sinful, those are problematic, those are systemic oftentimes that need to be addressed. They need to be the focus of our attention and activism and policy shaping. But that's only part of the picture. And this is where Pope Francis, he doesn't align it exactly this way, but he spends a lot of time in Laudato Si critiquing anthropocentrism. And this is focusing only on our species, only on humanity. There have been so many great scholars. I'm thinking especially of, ecofeminist theologians who have for decades pointed out that the way particularly women in the church and women in society are treated, and then we can compound that by women of indigenous descent or women of color and other marginalized communities are treated vis-a-vis men in society, right? Forms of oppression. That's reflective of the way that the human species oftentimes treats the rest of creation. It's again, this idea of the integral ecology. So it's not that we say, oh, we need to care just for non-human creation. Because again, I think that's that either or language, as if it's either humanity or non-human creation. I think with that the call to integral ecology, we need to recognize that the injustices that we perpetuate among one another in the human family are directly tied to the injustices the human species has, and continues to impose on the non-human aspects of creation. I oftentimes think about, the way that we talk about ourselves and the rest of creation is really, it says a lot if we pause and step back and think about it. I know right now in Erie, as Greg mentioned early on, you still have snow on the ground. It's a bit chilly out there these days, a late April. I don't know what April snow showers, if that brings any kind of Mayflowers, but you know, if it was nicer, somebody might say, oh, I need to get outside. I need to go into nature, spend some time in nature, as if we aren't nature too, as if we're not made up of everything else in the same way as Pope Francis mentions at the atomic and subatomic and even more macro level. So what does it look like? I think it looks different in the way we think about ourselves. That informs the way we speak about ourselves in relationship to the rest of creation. I think as we think and speak differently and see the world differently, it begins to inform the way we talk about and advocate for and imagine policy. I've described this as well too. Pope Francis calls for an integral ecology. Oikos logos means how we talk about the household, the oikos meaning the household, the earth. But I've often said the next step is an integral ecology demands an integral economy. It's oikos nomos, as I mentioned in my talk, is about how the law or the structure of the household. So an integral ecology should inform the way we organize ourselves and order ourselves, relate not only within the human family, but to the rest of creation. So that leads to action, of course, right? So I don't have I agree wholeheartedly with Pope Francis and with Greta Thunberg, both of whom in their own way basically are saying not everybody has to do the same thing. Thunberg at the end here in the quote that I shared says, if you have more responsibility, more power, more influence, bigger platform, you have a greater moral duty. Pope Francis says something similar. He says, each of us in our own locations and our own contexts and cultures have to respond. So I don't have a one size fits all, but I think it begins with us taking seriously our place within God's community of creation, or what St. Francis might say, the family of creation, the kinship of God's creation.
Thank you. So to follow up on that a little bit, if we shift our thinking about how we think about our humanity in relationship to nature, and as we do that, can you provide us perhaps with some suggestions of how, if we have young people who are looking to incorporate that into their day-to-day lives, and in what kinds of small ways can they do that, or in the larger picture in the United States, how we reduce or even withdraw from our addiction to things like carbon-based energies?
Yeah, so that's so important, and it's such a daunting question, as I'm sure you realize. So let me start with some of the little things, because I think that's where we need to start, precisely because the challenge is so daunting, it's so overwhelming. And so, like the very discourse that's rooted, it goes back to sacred scripture, to the Old Testament and New Testament. It's found in the medieval tradition of people like St. Francis of Assisi. We see it in Laudato Si as well, is that our discursive emphasis needs to change. So, we realize this, right? We realize this, we talk about this in other areas of our study. Students gathered here this evening, faculty here this evening, realize this, that words function. The way that people are identified or identify themselves, the way we describe and address and talk about and to one another has an actual impact for good and for ill. So I think a little thing we can do is it sounds silly. I recognize this. You might want to dismiss me as a hippie Franciscan who should stand in a bird bath with his Franciscan habit on. But think about the way we talk about something like nature or creation or the natural environment, and recognize that we are part of it too. That's one thing. The second thing is an invitation to mindfulness. So notice already, this is not requiring a lot of money. It's not necessarily requiring a lot of time, but it's requiring deliberation, intentionality. So the mindfulness is about thinking about the things we do every moment of every day and how those are possible in the first place. So I invite everybody, all the folks gathered on the webinar, to just pause for a minute and take a deep breath. Now, God willing, all of you have been doing that many, many hundreds of times this whole lecture. We've been breathing unthinkingly. But now think about where that air comes from and where the poison we breathed out, the carbon dioxide I exhaled, is going. Now think about what you had in your last meal, lunch or dinner or a snack, or think about the water that you need, without which you will not survive. or think about the clothing that you're wearing, or the house or the structure that is housing you. Or think about the fact that when you do have your next meal, you will not be able to digest this or metabolize it without the cooperation of other organisms and microbes within our body working with us to help us to live. That kind of mindfulness and attentiveness is important because it begins to shift our way of seeing the world and recognizing the truthfulness of that integral ecology. Now, from there, we can start to take other steps, right? It's not just because people are not compelled by obedience or like browbeating, right? I can't force you to want to use less, less carbon or to use less fossil fuels or something, right? So I think that's a starting point to help us to think about our integratedness into the whole of God's family of creation. But then we can start doing that discernment, doing that analysis, doing that examination of our lives and say, well, what can I do on the personal level, on the family level, in my dorm, in my community, in my local neighborhood, in society? Then I think the other thing we can do, and it grows from there, is working together to advocate for social change. And this includes things like institutional divestment of fossil fuel investments. It includes, advocating for, I saw that the Biden administration earlier today announced a goal of reducing emissions by 50%, I think by 2030 or 2050, I can't remember the date exactly. Advocating for that kind of policy, calling up your representatives, recognizing that in the United States, at least, and I'm speaking within this context, the principle of our government is supposed to be representative. They're there to enact, allegedly, what it is the people have asked for. And so let your voice be heard. And this isn't just me politicking or becoming political, as some people might say. I'm basically paraphrasing what Pope Francis says in chapter 5 of Laudato Si, that all of this integral ecology, ecological conversion, the call to remember that we are ha'adamah in Hebrew, made of the dust of the earth, has an implication, and the implication is putting our faith into action and working for social and political change. So that's a long-winded way, I think, of answering it. And I go back to what Thunberg and Pope Francis have said, that this has to be discerned on the individual and local level, because I can't tell you what is most urgent, right now on the campus of Mercyhurst or in Erie, Pennsylvania, or where other people are joining us around the globe. But we can begin to think and change and act.
Okay, I think we have to wrap this up soon, but I'm going to see if I can sort of smash a couple of questions together and address them from a couple of angles. You talked a little bit about the ways that we might divest from fossil fuels, from investments and those kinds of things. To what extent do you see the Vatican putting into practice some of the things that are coming out of Laudato Si? And on the other side, this would be entirely speculation on your part, but do you think that President Biden's Catholic faith influences the kinds of environmental work that he's engaging in?
Yeah, two very good questions. It's going to sound like a cop-out on the first one, because I don't know. Thankfully, I'm not a cardinal. I don't work in the Vatican, so I don't really know much about the planning. I will say this, that what little I do know is that these are live conversations. People like Cardinal Turkson, people like Cardinal Czerny, and others are actively talking about this, and these are commitments that the Holy Father is also engaged in. But the Holy See is complicated because it is both a kind of nation state and has all of the bureaucracy and the complicating intersections of what it's like to run a government, but it also is a faith organization, right? A leadership of the church. So there are a lot of moving parts. And I will say that I do know that a number of Vatican dicasteries are committed to supporting ecological development and climate justice in various ways. But I can't really speak to the specifics because that's not really my area, and I'm not directly connected to that. To the second point, I think this is it's a really kind of direct question that speaks to what was implied in a lot of my talk, and it's not directed toward Biden or one political party or another. But I need to be honest in answering, because it's a fair question. yes, I think President Biden, and it's no secret, as a man who goes to Mass every week, who's a man who's very publicly committed to his Catholic faith, who is a man, and just as an individual, who takes his Catholicism and the teaching of the church very seriously. Now, that's going to be a shock to some people who think through a myopic lens that says one life issue, one human-based life issue is the only thing that we use to evaluate anything else. And that's just, it's nonsense. It's insane. And it's not in keeping with the church's teaching. It is antithetical to a consistent ethic of life. Now, are there things that the Biden administration fails? Of course. It doesn't, President Biden as an individual and the Biden administration collectively is not the Catholic Party. There is no such thing in the United States, at least none in office. And so as a result, there's always room for growth. I recently signed a petition this week that was circulated by the Catholic Mobilizing Network for the abolition of the death penalty, advocating for President Biden to take that life issue very seriously to end the federal death penalty, right? A number of states have done this. And this is something that the church has identified, like abortion, like some other issues, as being intrinsically evil, as never being justified. As a Catholic, you cannot support the death penalty any more than you can support abortion in the same context. Again, news to many people, but when you think of only one issue as identified with our tradition, then you lose sight of these other things. But specifically on the topic of climate change, this is something I believe that informs the president's personal view. But I also think his administration has demonstrated a commitment to prioritizing this as an issue, as a policy issue. I've written about this in NCR, and others have reported on this in the New York Times and Washington Post and elsewhere. That in fact, the way I talked about it was precisely in regard to his Catholic faith. That he actually appointed, former Secretary of State John Kerry, himself also a Roman Catholic, to be an ambassador for climate change and climate justice internationally, and has appointed at a cabinet level other leaders to oversee the domestic policy development as well. So that's promising. I'd say that's promising, but it's not something to be left alone only for the politicians, or as Greta Thunberg might say, it's not only for the adults. It's something that all of us are implicated in. And so there's a lot of work to do, including holding our political representatives accountable for climate justice, and recognizing that that's not just a niche or kind of particular side issue. It is the foundation, or as I've called it tonight, the thread that holds together the seamless garment. If we don't have a planet on which life can flourish, then there's no point in advocating for human life at all.
Well, thank you so very much, Father Horan. This has really been a wonderful talk that you've given us tonight, and a lot for us to think about. We do need to wrap up this evening, but I want to thank you for your time and for your wisdom and your guidance in these things. And the Office of Mission, the Office of Sustainability, from the Evelyn Lincoln Institute of Ethics and Society. I want to thank all of our attendees tonight for your time and for your questions. And we are recording this, so it will be available eventually through the LES website. So once again, thank you to everyone for this evening, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you, Dr. Arad.